What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a fun video about the 5 most difficult CRPGs that I personally struggled with. Now, if you're new to the channel, I play and review a ton of games, really, but my favorite genre and the type of game that I tend to cover the most are CRPGs. I played a ton of them, I reviewed a ton of them, I've gotten 100% on a ton of them, which includes things like beating them on their highest difficulty, typically speaking. And as such, I get a lot of questions about games I struggled with or achievements I struggled with, that type of stuff. And I thought I'd make this video today just kind of talking about a few of those points here and there. But I want to preface this video with a few things right off the bat. For starters, my Steam profile is linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. 2. CRPGs tend to have very similar combat systems. I actually made a video recently about this. They can be divided up into a few different categories, but my point in telling you that is that once you've kind of figured out how CRPGs work, going forward, they tend to be less challenging overall. Meaning that in my personal experience, I've found that the order in which you play CRPGs tends to largely affect which ones you find difficult. So with these 5 CRPGs, I'm just going to kind of explain some of the timing and reasoning behind why these were difficult for me, or at least aspects of them were, and kind of go from there. Now, number 5 on our list to kick us off is Pillars of Eternity. Now, generally speaking, I don't consider Pillars of Eternity a super difficult game, but it was one of the titles from the early 2010s that sort of saw a modern revival of the CRPG genre, but the specific reason that I struggled with it is largely a dearth of information on the systems and classes and things, because while there is a codex for a lot of stuff like combat mechanics, etc., and you can pick up on that stuff, the real issue that I had with PoE was that it's very hard to plan your builds out, because the original Pillars of Eternity didn't tell you what your upcoming stuff was. So the only real way to figure that out was to basically just learn what each class was going to get ability-wise at what level, because until you get a class to that level in-game, it just doesn't tell you. And the fact that they added that in with Pillars of Eternity 2 made that game significantly easier. But on to our number 4 spot. Now, number 4 here is actually what is, in my opinion, at least from what I can see as a YouTuber, is largely considered one of the most difficult CRPGs, and that is Underrail. Now, fortunately for me, I played Underrail pretty recently, actually, but this is also after it had already received most of its updates. A lot of the problems had been ironed out since its release in 2015, and frankly, I had just played tons of CRPGs already, so I didn't struggle with it as much as a lot of people tend to. But nonetheless, Underrail is a difficult game. It's not something I would recommend to newcomers to the genre at all, and even people familiar with the genre tend to struggle with it because of its structure and, in some ways, rather dated quest design, etc. And with Underrail in particular, the problem I had was the last boss, actually. Because I went into this game largely blind, and while a build can go through a variety of situations, the last boss in particular really requires a specific type of approach, and if you build properly, you can actually one-shot the last boss in a single round of combat. But going in blind, if you're not expecting that, and you don't really see the mechanics coming up, it can be a real struggle. The last boss was a real pain, and fortunately for me, they have a puzzle right before the last boss that will weaken it significantly if you take the rather substantial amount of time it will take to solve it, which is how I ultimately got through it. But the difficulty spikes of Underrail are honestly something else, even for a seasoned veteran. Now, 3rd on our list, we have Pathfinder Kingmaker. Now, Kingmaker is a bit of a special case because it was really my first deep dive into the Pathfinder rule set. While I was pretty familiar with D&D 3.5, which is what Pathfinder is based on, there is, of course, some differences nonetheless. Combine that with the just overwhelming amount of information that there is to know about Pathfinder, as well as just its implementation in Kingmaker, things that work, things that don't, the rather notorious unfair difficulty, and ultimately I was left with a very love-hate relationship with Kingmaker. I put a review out for it, which is true of basically all of these games, but Kingmaker in particular really feels like you want to enjoy it, but it's fighting you every step of the way in terms of its mechanics, things not being explained, things not being very visually clear, a lot of which the sequel, Wrath of the Righteous, cleared up, which was very nice. But when people see my Pathfinder knowledge, a lot of that just comes from struggling with Kingmaker, which took a substantial amount of time. So with that franchise in particular, I really feel like my knowledge of that system and how to use it effectively was very hard won. Now, for our number 2 spot, we have Divinity Original Sin 2. Now, if you're new to the channel or just a recent addition in general, you might not know that one of the backbones of this channel was Divinity Original Sin 2, followed by the Divinity series as a whole. I love the Divinity series. I started playing Original Sin 2 first, and then I loved that game so much, I was like, I need to know everything about this franchise. But the reason I struggled with it so much is that while I had played CRPGs quite a bit, Original Sin 2 and its release was really the game that reinvigorated my own love for the genre, and I can honestly safely say that this channel probably would not exist in the state that it's in if it was not for that game. But the thing I struggled with in particular was Honor Mode. Now, this is effectively an Iron Man mode, but also on the highest difficulty. Now, these days, there's quite a few ways you could easily cheese that mode if you really wanted to, but what was difficult about this was that I deliberately chose not to do that, and I took what I would consider an optimized but fairly regular party all the way through the game, all the fights, etc. And it was a giant pain. The fight I struggled with the most was actually the Kraken fight in Act 4, because the party comp that I chose to use for the rest of the game for the sake of making a lot of other fights easier left me rather unoptimized for the Kraken fight, and one of my self-imposed rules for this run was not using the magic mirror so much. Like in a couple instances to respec a few things, sure, but I didn't want to hire a bunch of mercs, optimize a party, etc. for just one fight. That felt a little disingenuous for me for what I was going for at the time, and I really struggled with that Kraken fight, but I did eventually do it. But it was a real nail-biter for me. But much like Pathfinder, I left that run in particular with just a pretty profoundly deep knowledge of all things Divinity Original Sin 2, and that love for that title spiraled into an entire lore series for the entire Divinity series, and it was just a ton of fun. From here, let's talk about the single most difficult CRPG that I ever struggled with, and that is what might surprisingly be, for some people, to find out, actually the game Tyranny. Now, overall, Tyranny is not terribly difficult on normal difficulties, but if you turn it up to Path of the Damned, the first act of Tyranny is a nightmare. It gets easier as the game progresses and you get access to things, which is common across games, honestly, but the first act of Tyranny in Path of the Damned is awful. And what I struggled with in particular was the very last fight of Act 1, because you are severely outnumbered. The boss is actually a group of people. They have fantastic team comp. And no matter how I built my characters, no matter what spells I crafted, I just kept getting destroyed. And ultimately, what I think finally won it was just a combination of pure luck and a little bit of line of sight cheese on the hallway leading into the room. But I kid you not, I died on that fight probably 50 plus times. I don't remember exactly. This was back in 2020. But it was easily the most trouble I've ever had with a CRPG was that one particular fight, which kind of makes sense because in the context of things, that was about when I started really 100%ing a lot of stuff and kind of approaching it from a channel content perspective. And Tyranny was one of the early CRPGs that I was kind of really pushing for that formula on. And thankfully, for my sanity, the game did get much easier once I finally beat that fight. But man, that was a monster. There you guys go. Just some of the CRPGs I personally struggled with for a variety of reasons. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, maybe even consider joining the channel as a member. You get some awesome perks. You can help support the channel and future content, which I certainly appreciate if you choose to do it. But regardless, either way, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.